Siblings and sisters and brothers, welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. We are so glad to be here with each one of you today. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series where we faithfully care for the whole of people. We often have prayer, worship, or music, and compassionate teachings like we will today all throughout. Today, we continue on in our series called The State of the Matter, and we will be speaking to lean into and honor Reverend Karen George's language, a global perspective holding a global awareness to the state of women, about how we can continue to make change locally with this global view. So with nothing further from me, I want to introduce to you our esteemed Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson.
Good afternoon from where I am, and it is good to be present once again for Thursdays for the Soul. And I am just going to get right into our conversation for today is what I want to say, because I want to be inclusive in my use of time when I speak about time, because our guests today are from multiple time zones. So with us today are Casey Harden, who's the General Secretary for the World YWCA, and she's located in Geneva, Switzerland, where it is after 9 p.m. So thank you so much. We also have Dr. Suchi Gaur, who is the Director of Global Engagement and Impact, also with the World YWCA. We have Margaret Mitchell, who is the President and CEO for the Greater Cleveland YWCA, so right here in our hometown of Cleveland. And then Meti Gamuchu, who is the Youth Leadership Development Programs Coordinator, and she is in Ethiopia, where it is well after midnight where she is. So thank you all for being present. March is Women's History Month. And I thought it was important, as we talked about the State of the Matter series, to think about the state of women for this particular time. And as we talk about women and the importance of women in community, it is also a truth that women are severely marginalized and impacted by adversity globally. And so in this moment, it's not just about the negative, but also the opportunities that are presenting themselves. And I would suggest the ways in which global movements are also working to reverse some of those demographics and markers that have been experienced over the years. So I've invited our guests, and the question that I would like to ask in this moment of them is the following. Can you identify what you see as the greatest challenges facing women and girls globally? And what are some of the ways that you are addressing these issues? And what I would like to do is to start with Casey, and then have Margaret follow up, and then go to Suchi and to Meti to talk about, for you to frame the issues so that we could get a broad perspective. So if you could go in that order, I will not come back until you are all finished. And then we want to engage questions in the chat, because I really want our audience to be able to hear from you today.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Karen Georgia. I want to not only thank you, Karen Georgia, and your team that's made this webinar so easy, but also a big thanks to United Church of Christ for inviting YWCA Global Movement and a local YWCA to be part of this conversation. And I bring greetings from tens of thousands of YWCA leaders in 100 countries around the world. So my answer to you, Karen Georgia, and the question that you posed is violence against women. I joined the YWCA about 25 years ago. It was a YWCA in Tacoma, Washington. And at that time, we had a lot of services for what was then called the issue of battered women. The shelter was always full. Various housing methods, hotel rooms were always full. There was always a waiting list of counseling services for children affected by this plight of battered women, and the needs far exceeded what was available to help. And since then, the name of the plight of gender-based violence or violence against women has taken many names: domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, and so on. But what hasn't changed during those 25 years is the very existence of this violence against women. At YWCA, we see it and we know it as the world's largest human rights violation, and it happens in every country around the world. It happens regardless of age, background, socioeconomic status, faith, or tradition, and it happens at home, in schools, at work, in public, and within our faith communities. So to bring it into the here and now, during when the pandemic began, so February and March, when we really knew that this was going to be a pandemic, the World YWCA, we said to ourselves, we've got to have conversations with our leaders that are on the ground. That is how YWCA is effective and has been around for 160 years, is these fantastic leaders in community that know the needs of the community, can work with the community to affect change for good. So we held conversations online. We did our best to get everyone from every region online. So during the first round of conversation, the discussion was on personal protective equipment, impact of isolation measures, how the YWCAs were going to adapt to not being able to be together for whatever reason in person. A few weeks later, we said, okay, we need to have these conversations again. So we scheduled webinars again, and we got on. And for that second round of conversation, no matter the community, the country, the region, the continent, every single YWCA leader spoke of the same issue, and that was violence against women. So without an exception, that was an issue that YWCAs were trying to tend to. So this issue that we know also all too well of violence against women was still existing, but was really taking on a role, was a second pandemic within the COVID pandemic, really exacerbated by the impact of isolation measures, the breakdown of some of the systems and protections that have been put in place to really work against societal and cultural norms and system norms that lead to the very violence against women. So we know globally 35% of women have experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner. And we know that due to the COVID pandemic, calls to helplines have increased 5-fold in some countries. And those are just the countries where we can track that kind of metric. So YWCAs, we're doing what we've always done. And I've heard this from a lot of our peers in the faith community. We've really pulled on all the creativity, resilience, smarts, responsiveness, relevancy that defines YWCA leadership, those tens of thousands of leaders I spoke to. The next stat I want to share is that less than 40% of women who experience violence seek help of any sort. And in the majority of countries with available data on this issue, among women who do seek help, most look to family and friends, and very few look to formal institutions. There are lots of reasons why that is the case. A lot of it has to do with all the systems that are not fair, not just, not trustworthy, and in fact work against the rights of people and women. But what I want to do is bring this to the conversation tonight, and that is often that for many women, church can be a place of safety, and it can be an institution that women turn to. However, I've seen in my over 20 years in this work that those churches, those faith communities, they must make a sustained, consistent, and really bold effort to speak of violence against women so that there is trust by women that their faith community will in fact be a place of safety, that it won't perpetrate even more victimization on the victim. When I spoke earlier about the first YWCA I was with, it was in Tacoma, Washington, had fantastic services, but I didn't know then that I was also in an incredibly responsive multi-community service kind of habitat. And part of that was an incredibly effective multi-faith initiative, interfaith initiative. The faith institutions were as involved, if not more involved, and really actually were the leaders in services for victims and survivors in a way I've never seen since. They were holding the community accountable for addressing the perpetrators, the systems that failed the victims, and also the systems that often re-victimize the victim. And they held themselves accountable, right, as a church and faith institutions, to really be a role model in doing all of that. I want to end with just naming that YWCA is part of the Thursdays in Black initiative of the World Council of Churches, and I have the privilege to serve as an ambassador. And at my first meeting, I was asked to share what is it that I think is important as for Thursdays in Black, as an ecumenical effort to really address this plague on humanity, this scourge on humanity of violence against women. And I want to share that with you today. And that's, let us call this violence against women what it is, and use words that speak plainly and don't obfuscate the violence. Let's not use words that make other people feel comfortable, but instead bring us into a zone of discomfort that really motivates us to affect change. Let us not only speak of victims, victimization, and survivorship, but really also the perpetrators and the patriarchy and the systems that nurture the violence. Last thing, the National Online Resource Center on Domestic Violence has a really good piece called, it's like 5 to 10 pages. It's called Violence Against Women and the Role of Religion. And in it, there's a line that's so powerful and it catches me every time. And it says, no woman should ever be forced to choose between safety and her religious community or tradition. So I share that tonight as a call to action to everyone that's part of this evening.
Thank you, General Secretary Harden. It is so good to see you, and it's just wonderful to be with all of you and to be in this forum around this very, very important topic. I want to echo everything that General Secretary Harden has said, and I want to add to that just the important intersectionality of racism as it relates to gender violence. And so my work here with YWCA of Greater Cleveland really revolves so deeply at that intersection. And what we know is that this is an intersection that is not about Cleveland or the United States, but is a global issue as well. Whether you're talking about racism or caste systems, we know that women of color, wherever they are in the world, are not believed. And for Black women, almost wherever they are in the world, there is this thought of even gender violence. How could they be the victim? And from the adultification of young girls that we see all around the world, girls victimized and adultified to women who add their voice and the chorus of being Black, brown, Latina in this space or around the world. Race has a very important role to play, and we must elevate it to understand how racism has really sort of worked against this movement as we think about gender violence. It has really sort of been centered not on Black or brown women, but really on majority women, on white women, and it is important for us to make sure that all victims are believed, that all women are elevated, and that in that we bring along Black and brown sisters. we have, in 2019, we really began to understand the impact of racism on public health. Here we celebrated or really commemorated 400 years since the start of slavery in 1619, and so 2019 was 400 years. And we marked that time with a commemoration. We held a 2-day summit here in Cleveland. And as we were doing the planning all throughout 2019, we recognized that we wanted to have a call to action at the end of that commemoration. And so we identified that the truth is, racism is a public health emergency. Racism is a public health crisis. And so many markers, we can go down the line of naming almost anything. And we can see just the impact, the harm. I loved how Casey said, let's call a thing a thing. And so we made that call to action. And of course, we could never see how the United States and the world would explode around the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And we never want, we want to understand the real cost of blood and how blood is required for growth and the value of blood. And so we have seen our work around racism as a public health crisis really accelerate in a way that we could have never imagined. And so on this frame of understanding gender violence, I would add the intersectionality of racism, and that we must really add clarity to our voices to understand how the body of Christ is hurt by racism, the local body, the big C church body, and what we must do to dismantle this. There's no question in my mind that racism is a demonic force, has been a demonic force, and yet we know something greater. And it is really exciting to see the work happening here and around the world to dismantle this demon.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much. Thank you, Casey. I think this is just amazing because both these thoughts are so critical, and it lands to a lot that I had in mind with respect to the topic, because I feel very strongly that the pandemic has highlighted one of the biggest crises of the world, which is access of women to digitalization, to digital tools and technology, and how restricted that is all around the world. And very clear example is that when the world shut down with this pandemic, we realized that the only way to go is digital. The only way to go is connect through technology. The only way to go is get support through technology. But what it also highlights is the fact that even now, more than 2 to 3 billion women all around the world do not have access to cell phones. The gender gap with access to cell phones and technology and resources is getting wider and wider every day. And there's data and evidence that supports that every year, the gender gap with respect to technology is just increasing. What is critical is that during this pandemic, we were as at the World YWCA, we saw this very evidently as well. When we were talking about gender-based issues, when we were talking about, what do we do? Our jobs are getting lost. There is no access to resources for women. We realized also that getting this information from ground, from women, also was taking its own curve, given the fact that technology was such a big barrier. So when I talk about digitalization, I think 3 key issues I can see in front of me, one of which is access, for sure. But the second is the different experiences that women have with respect to technology, the intersectionality, the intergenerational age groups and how they access technology, how women in rural versus urban access technology, how just literacy and digital literacy plays a very, very critical role in women accessing technology. And also how safety, digital safety and systems are not being designed keeping women in mind. We know this. Over the years, feminist technology has drastically grown. Investment in technology, which is made by women, which supports evidence of data of women, has drastically grown, but it's still not there. We are still facing a big dearth of an understanding of looking at technology from a feminist lens, looking at technology from a women specific lens. And also the fact that women are experiencing these tools in a very different manner. When we were looking at the whole pandemic, the whole crisis, and it started shaping up, one of the key things that we started to look at was how are women and young women in the YWCA movement and who are in the communities also accessing these technology systems. And a great example is what was happening in Belarus. Our young leaders, our activists were using technology to advocate, to come online, to push their activism despite all the technology lockdowns that were happening. And there was innovation in that. But on the other hand, we had a young woman in Nepal who was leading a group with her church and the youth of the community in providing mental health support and counseling to those who were losing their jobs, to the young people who were losing their jobs, to the young women who were losing their jobs. So there is an element of how these technologies are being used. And during the pandemic, those evidence has come up that women experience these systems very differently. They use these systems very differently. A lot of these places, women actually went online and started looking at, oh, I don't have a job, like I don't have access to any employment now. Let me just see how masks are made. And a lot of communities all around the world, a lot of women communities started using YouTube to learn how to make masks and started selling that. So there is the munching part of technology is very different when it comes to women versus men. And I think one of the core part that we also understood at World YWCA was we don't need to innovate with technology all the time. We need to innovate the use of technology. We need to showcase how we are using technology with more humanitarian approach, with a more human rights based approach, with providing a safe space experience, which also localizes the usage. So at World YWCA, our legacy safe space model, which talks about providing a comfortable environment, providing a safe zone, providing intergenerational approach and human rights based principles, we immediately shifted it into a virtual safe space model. And young women all around the world, women in our movement, took up the model and they started these conversations, these virtual safe spaces, these cup of joy, where they were coming together digitally and talking to each other and sharing their anxieties and feeling not alone. And that in itself was how we didn't innovate and come up with a new technology system, but we said we can use technology in a feminist manner. So I think there are three core learnings I see that the pandemic has had, especially with respect to women and technology. One is that digital tools and safety is a very big problem. We ourselves at World YWC experienced online trolling, and we realized there are like Zoom in itself doesn't have at many times, unless you pay a very good version, technology safety procedures for groups to be not attacked and trolled publicly. So digital safety is something which is yet not explored to the point that it should be. It's not something where policy advocacy is that strengthened. And I feel like that is one of the critical areas we need to work on. Second, as I said, customizing the use of tool to suit the realities of the women around the world is very, very critical. When we do social media campaigns since the whole of last year, we know which region, plays on which tool, which technology, which social media platform to suit the reality of their space, to suit the experience of women there. And the third and most innovative point is innovative tools are not enough. Tools can come and go all the time. It's about how we use those tools, how we ensure the creation of those tools is based on human rights principles, is based on feminist values, it's based on honesty and truth and trust and accountability and transparency that can come up with organizations. And there's so much lobbying that needs to be done still with respect to that. I want to finish with some questions that keep on coming in my mind when we are thinking of these things. One is how we need to think constantly of how do we make digital literacy an ongoing process? Because we at World Y experienced before the pandemic. There was women were using technology all around the world, but not everyone was digitally there. A lot because they were not digitally aware, a lot because they didn't feel the need for it. But when the pandemic happened, everyone moved digitally. Some YWCAs, some countries were forced to move digitally. And there was that gap in digital literacy still exists. That we get that feedback all the time, that we need more training, we need more awareness. These tools are innovating too quickly. How do we keep up with them? And women face that more. So there's an understanding that we need to look at women and digital literacy a lot. The second part, I think, is how are we planning to include voices of women when we are developing these digital tools? I don't think the digital systems right now are designed to make it a smoother experience for women all over the world. So I think that voices inclusion is critical. There is an element of how do we keep it safe, and how do we how do we learn from these experiences on the go. I don't find, at least so many digital platforms I have written to, I don't find them doing enough. They are doing just what is keeping them safe from legal suits. The next thing is, how do we look at policies all across the world with respect to digital tools from a very gender lens? We are not doing that. The policies are defined for citizens. They're not defined for how the experiences for women and men from other marginalized genders. And then how are young women leading this discourse of discussion and of debate around technology, around feminist technology? Our young women have such varied experiences, and they are sharing those experiences at different platforms. But we need to constantly think on how we bring in young back into this discussion. And the last was not I can't emphasize this enough, of how digital world needs to be human rights based. Internet access is not human rights based. Internet access is not equal for all the genders, for all across the world. So digitalization, again, very close to my heart personally, because my activism journey started from writing blogs, going to the field, meeting women, talking to them, bringing their stories on ground. I find myself becoming a channel. I found myself becoming a channel for those women. And now when I see that even after so many years, it's only getting worse, I truly feel there is a need to talk more often about it, to talk more openly about it, and to advocate more openly about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suchi, for sharing your experiences. I can say that it is very relatable to everything that has been discussed before, and it's so relatable for everyone from everywhere in the world. I would like to frame the conversation in regards to young people and the COVID pandemic, specifically on young women and how it's affected us. There's the pandemic in general was such a surprise for anyone around the world, especially for countries in Africa where it was a bit late. Like, we were looking at the world suffering, and we kind of had this arrogance that it wouldn't reach us for at least a little while. And then, surprise, in less than a month, it was there, and it was not something that we can stop or control, and our whole lives changed overnight. The government guidelines were very strict for the pandemic, and school closures were one of the actions that were taken, and that was one of the most dangerous actions that I have noticed, honestly, because of that school closures, students were out of school all the time, and they had to stay at home. And the more they stayed at home, especially young women, were forced into manual labor, among other things, including early and forced child marriage, is higher than any time we've ever seen in history. So these are some of the issues that we have seen, and the biggest out of all of this, the biggest challenge that I have noticed was the response to the pandemic itself, and how it was not framed towards being gender sensitive. I don't know how it was assumed that COVID only affected men. I don't know when that was part of the conversation, but it felt that way at some point, because we had to deal as YWCA Ethiopia, and as the world, because of the World YWCA support, we had to deal with situations where quarantine centers were running out of sanitary pads. And this is not something that's supposed to be surprising. Women get their periods, and of course we need sanitary pads. It should have been thought of in the first place. And having to advocate and saying that, no, you need to work on this, you have to be gender sensitive, you have to think of women as well, was something very heartbreaking, honestly, because you don't expect to have these conversations after years and years and years of advocating and working so hard to make sure that women are part of the conversation, and then having to convince women themselves that this is supposed to be a priority again. And this is just scratching the surface because like I said, education is very important, and schools were closed for over a year and just reopened, and it's expected that over 10 million girls will not go back to school because of early and forced child marriages, because of different traditional practices, and because of different reasons because of this pandemic. And it was a problem getting them to school in the first place, but having them to stop and then go back is a completely different conversation itself. And because of this reason, if especially in countries like mine, in Ethiopia, unless you get an education, you don't get a good job. Unless you don't get a good job, you don't become economically independent. And if you're not independent, then you have to be forced into situations that are not going to be comfortable or safe for that matter. And that is the reality of the young women and women in my country right now. And I'm sure that's the situation all over the world. And in ways of mitigating this, I believe that advocacy plays such a huge role, because we were able to see huge change after advocating for months and months on getting more gender sensitive responses. And there are guidelines for the African Union has also written a document, and the World Health Organization as well, on how to respond to the pandemic. And gender is also a big part of both those documents, and using that to advocate to the different ministries and different government levels has been helpful, and that has shown us some effect. But it shows that we still have a long way to go when we talk about gender, when we talk about young women and education, and apparently simple things like sanitary pads. And something I would like to say to wrap up everything I've tried to explain, even though it's a bit everywhere, is that something I've learned from this pandemic is that it's made me question that, did the pandemic make things worse, or did it just make us pay more attention in regards to everything that was going on? Were we blind in the first place, or did this just happen overnight? And that's a question that I ask myself every time I get up and go to work and try to make at least even the smallest amount of difference. And I think that is something that we should all ask ourselves, and to be more open-minded, and to be more, to see more, actually, to notice more, and to understand that there's more happening. And I think sometimes obliviousness is something that we choose, even though we don't want to, unconsciously. And I think that it's time for us to stop being so oblivious to what's going on around the world, and to step up. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your initial thoughts, which were just incredibly powerful, and gave so much food to thought. I've been sitting here taking notes because it's just been so rich, and I'm so sorry that our time is so short. So I think the everything that's been said here around violence against women, the intersectionality between race and violence, the pieces around technology, and now what has been raised about women and girls in particular, and what we're seeing in these pandemic times with the possibility of what this means for the literacy of women is incredibly important. So I want to frame a few questions, and I want to start with Suchi. There's the question here is, can you give an example of how the technology for women is different, or how it could be or should be different when you talk about and raise the issues about especially digital safety. And thank you, Casey, for the resource. We will make sure that those resources are sent out to everyone on the call. So I just want to raise that in terms of the resource that Casey mentioned about safety.
Thank you, Karen. I think it's a very interesting question. You know, very often in my own ways of talking about technology, I talk to young women, young girls, young boys, and try to understand how they look at technology and how they look at use of these social media tools and systems. Very often, when I ask young women, I hear that they don't see enough conversations about the issues that they are facing. They don't see enough safe platforms for them to talk about their stories. They don't see very critical issues which are often ignored but are so important, something like menstruation, something like menopause, and they don't see those being discussed. During the pandemic itself, a lot of women reached out. I'm a big advocate for women's health, and I do a lot of that work around my space also. And a lot of women reached out to us, sharing these stories of how they were facing issues with sexual and reproductive health and rights during that period, because they were stuck at home, they were not having access to the doctor, they didn't know what to do, they were googling, but that's not the exact way. There were also issues with unwanted health issues that were coming up because of being stuck in the house. And I connected with one of my doctor colleagues, and we started a whole My Health chat. And women came out, and we've been doing this for the past many months. We've done 25 of those now. And women have come out and shared their real evidence stories from their lives, their circles, their families, their larger community at work, telling how we have discussed issues around cervical cancer, menstrual health, uh, menopause. We have even gone ahead and spoken a lot about mental health and the dilemmas that they deal with. Every woman, every chat onwards says that they do not have a platform like this. They look forward to that conversation hour. Technology and how it has been designed has not kept the issues and the problems and the challenges that women go through in mind. It has not provided them with conversation circles. It has not provided them with enough curated discussion forums or knowledge platforms or tools, and they feel lost that ways. And if you look at it, they are very different. Women face a variety of different issues that men face. So I also feel it's not just that. With young women coming in picture and using technology, they are looking for those options, they are looking for those innovations, and they are innovating around it. So there's a lot of feminist technology work that is being done because of this very need. And I think it is not enough, like it's not yet explored enough, given my own personal experience of trying to use technology differently. I also feel technology, the fact that it has not been designed safe for women, is because of this very fact, because we have not kept their experiences accounted, and we don't realize how they get trolled, or what are the experiences they go through, and versus how men go through. So that in itself also shapes up how technology and the use of technology becomes so different for men, women. And when I say women, I also know women of all around the world experience it differently. So I hope that answers.
Thank you so much. I also want to follow up both with Margaret and Casey for your thoughts. And thank you for raising Thursdays in Black. We're both actually Thursdays in Black ambassadors for the WCC. So I have my little Thursdays in Black background for today. But I want to raise the question as we talk about intersectionality for both of you, both from a global perspective and then also here in the US, about the violence that is also experienced by Indigenous women, which is often also, even as we raise the issues for African descendant women. Can you say a little bit about this for Indigenous women?
Sure. I'll start with a global perspective. So I think you make a really good point about, I mean, it's not a point, it's a point of comparison in terms, for me, of African descended women versus indigenous cultures all around the world. The point of comparison that I think is important isn't what's worse, you know, but instead is the response as responsive and as strong? Is as much care and action and activism being taken to address the plight, the realities of indigenous women around the world? So what we know is that there's a dearth of data for indigenous cultures around the world. There is a dearth of studies. There is not even a comparable amount of resources put toward really studying and responding to and raising the issue and cultivating activism and responses from an institutional level as it relates to indigenous women. So in that way, we have a lot of work to do. However, if we could all change our norm and our paradigm about the leaders that we follow, there are so many women leaders and women's organizations on the ground all over the world that are indigenous themselves and or are working with indigenous populations. So it's not like there's not something there that doesn't have traction, but the way that we are set up, the way resources are funneled, how space is taken up when we do our activism, we just need to turn it upside down. And so while I would say in the traditional realms of where the money is, where the resources are, who gets media attention, there's a dearth. But we know at the YWCA, and I know just as a woman activist, that there's just incredible work being done by women from indigenous cultures all around the world.
I would just add to what Dr. Suchi and what General Secretary Harden has said is that, we have to really understand misogyny. And even when we think about technology, I mean, one of the big technology platforms was designed to rank women. That was what it was all about. So let's begin to understand, the true roots and how that lives out in our hearts and minds. I think when we think about Indigenous women, we certainly do see an incredibly high number of incidents in terms of gender violence and assault all over the world. And then you compare that to the rate of reporting, which is very, very low. And so that is something we really have to shift. We are currently coming up to the end of our first week of our 2021 21-day challenge. And our third week is going to be focused on gender violence. And we do have quite a bit of focus around Indigenous women during that week. And so you can find the challenge on our website at the YWCA, but we've also partnered with a number of YWCAs across the country who are launching the challenge, which was created by Debbie Irving with her book, Waking Up White, and Dr. Eddie Long Jr. and Dr. Margaret Picnic. And we have adapted from their work, and this is our third year with the challenge, and 5,000 people in Cleveland are taking the challenge. And, we just felt like gender violence was just so important to really take that deep dive into understanding these issues. When we can look at and acknowledge and address, then we can move into the redress. And the redress is so important. On a personal perspective, that's what Casey is talking about. Redress yourself around who you're following and how you're leaning in. But it is also, redress is also about repair. Redress is also about reconciliation and these restorative practices, this change that has to happen. And of course, we have to really stay committed to change and really stay committed to the long term, because these threads have existed for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we too are socialized in this certain way around this misogyny. It's why it's so, the blindness that Meta spoke so beautifully about, that is the science, the literal science of oppression creates that blindness.
Thank you for those responses. Again, we will be preparing a resource list for you. We're gleaning much of what is being said. We're amassing all those links and everything to make them available. We have about maybe 6 minutes left. And I just want to follow up because there's so much that has been said here. And I want to go back to you, Meti, and ask about the Days for Girls that talks about international supplies and sustainable, reusable, reusable menstrual pads and all those kinds of things. As you talk about that kind of really pragmatic challenge that we don't often think about when we think about pandemic, and even what it means to be on your period and not have access to something like a menstrual pad. So.
I think generally at first it was the problem of having access in general, but after some time, obviously you adapt in these situations, and there was some use of reusable pads. But girls, I think the organization you called was Days for Girls. That is not necessarily available here currently, at least not in Ethiopia. And I did not even have any knowledge of the organization at all before. But there is something very local by someone called Dr. Freni, and she won the BBC Person of the Year last year. I think you might have heard of her, but she's been doing reusable sanitary pads for a while, and she was also part of helping in that response as well. But still, there was a lot going on in the country. While we were dealing with a pandemic, there were also other crises in regards to government reform and different things. So there was a problem with access again, but also when you're trying to source something from one place and when that place is shut down, that also brings another challenge in itself. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That is very helpful. I know that we have several questions, and we will not, some of it that's popping up from our audience. And I know that we can't get to all of these. So we might find resources to get to some of this. In the about 3 minutes that we have left, I just want to ask briefly, what is one sign of hope? And I know this is a big question, but what is one sign of hope for you when you look at women's issues, or one current indicator that gives you hope? And I want to start, if you could frame that in about a sentence or two, we'll just answer that in the same order, starting with Casey, Margaret, Suchi, and then Meti. And if you could just be brief.
Sure. Yeah, I'll begin. I believe, so on the positive, sunny note, and a transformative note and a paradigm shift note, we have seen such an amazing response to the pandemic. It is something that has impacted women globally, and there has been a very, very strong, smart, creative, and relevant response. So that gives me great hope. You know, the seams were tested, the seams are holding up and coming back together.
I can tell you what gives me hope. Medi gives me hope. And the young women around the world, I am just so excited. And I am willingly excited about who will come behind me in my seat and in any seat that Medi and other young women want. We are in really, really good hands.
I think I have something similar answer, but I think the stories from ground are giving me a lot of hope. The amazing work that is being done, but also just listening to how young women and women all around the world are questioning, are challenging their own selves and growing and developing their own strengths and leadership during this process of, I mean, I saw a pandemic for the first time in my life, and I did it with a 1-year-old child. So I feel like there are so many who don't have resources and have still innovated constantly. And I hear those stories and they give me so much hope that we are so resilient. Women are so resilient and we build resilient communities. And that's what I'm literally, that's what drives me every day to work.
What gives me hope currently is the fact that we're able to have these intergenerational dialogues, and the fact that we can actually have these conversations as women, as diverse women from different backgrounds. That gives me hope that we can actually unite as a world as well.
Thank you all so much. As I said on one of the last webinars I did, this will not be the last conversation of this nature that we have. It's incredibly important that we continue to elevate these issues. I know that it has been posted in the chat, but I invite you, as you are able, to consider a gift to the World YWCA. And you can do so at www.worldywwca.org/donate. And we're going to put that into the resources that we send out, so that you can have access to that. And also, please consider a gift to the YWCA of Cleveland. And I have been participating in the 21-day challenge. Today is the 4th day. It is not too late. It is very engaging. It's podcasts, videos, readings. I'm somebody who's been involved in the movement for racial justice for most of my adult life, and I am learning things as I go. So I just want to invite you. It's never too late to learn something else, to learn something new, and to pick up new resources for the journey that lies ahead. So I just want to thank Casey Harden for your leadership worldwide, Margaret Mitchell, both as a global leader, but for your leadership at the Cleveland Y, Dr. Suchi, Gaur, your leadership, and Meti Gamuchu, your leadership as well. So thank you very much for this time that we have spent together.
And for all of you watching in the United Church of Christ and beyond, if this conversation has made a difference for you, if this has given you things to think about and things to do within your congregation or within the world so that we may move closer to the world God imagines for all of us, consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. I also want to let you know about a few things that are upcoming in our Tuesday, Thursday webinar series. On Tuesday, we're going to be talking about Beyond the Children's Moment and Children's Ministry Today with programmatic suggestions about what you can do in your congregations and communities. On Thursday, a week from today, will be a Lenten hour of prayers and reflections. And as always, you can learn more about the events upcoming by going to ucc.org and scrolling all the way down the page to where we'll have calendar invites for all of these events and where you can register and join in. Thank you so much for joining with us today and each week as we journey together in this wilderness of both becoming who we're called to be and being resilient for each other along the journey. So from here, I'm going to pass it back to Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson to close us in a prayer for the rest of our day and into the evening for some of you.
Thank you. By now, many who realize when I host, I close with a poem. So here's the moment of benediction. And it's a poem that I wrote called Walking Wounded. And it starts with, the wound is the place where the light enters you. And that's from Rumi. There is a resident brokenness that sits, quietly humming, yearning for attention, demanding to be seen. These broken places pool with fear, stagnant waters teeming with all that festers, bringing bitterness, lives fragmented, overflowing with despair. We limp along, walking sharp edges on the borders of fertile grounds that call, yet we resist, afraid. And when we touch the darkness, we feel tiny slivers of light. We hear the music, we feel the emptiness, and taste hope. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.